encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network.
Welcome to Inside the Scholar Study, where we discuss all things concerning Scripture, faith, and scholarship. My name is Brad McNutt, and if you're ready, we're going to go inside the Scholar Study. And if you're watching us on video, you will find that he is actually in his study as we enter into these things.
That's true.
You
are too, right? You're in your study, right?
Well, if you can call what I do studying, like I don't know, like
right.
I'm just kind of imitating, just trying to keep up a little bit.
Right.
But yes. Actually, no, it's a green screen. I don't own any books.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes. So we're both in our study areas, and so we're going to continue this discussion of the season. We're looking at textual criticism. Episode 1 was kind of an introduction to the Greek New Testament, even the books themselves, the nature of the text, and or at least a little bit. And then episode 2, last episode, we looked at an example of textual criticism. And then today we're calling streams of evidence.
Yeah, and we'll talk about some of that streams of evidence in a little bit. That refers to, again, we're thinking about the critical apparatus to a critical edition of the Greek New Testament and sort of what kinds of things are in there. But I do, before we launch into that, I do want to think about a couple other things. One thing is, what if you want a book on this sort of thing? What should you get? Of course, there are a lot of books on the topic of how we got the Bible, and even on the more specific topic of textual criticism of the New Testament. There's a lot of books on that. Even if you are looking for a book on textual criticism of the New Testament for people who are not scholars, there are a lot of books there to choose from. So, there are plenty of choices. I would recommend this one, partly because I know the guys that wrote it. This is called Scribes and Scripture. It is, the two guys that wrote it are John Mead and Peter Gurry, and it was published by Crossway in 2022. And it was, there are book awards and I'm thinking of the Christianity Today. That's a magazine. They, every December, I think they hand out book awards. And they've got all kinds of different categories. And this was one. I think it didn't, in a particular category, what was the category? I don't know, academic biblical studies, maybe. And it didn't win the top award, but it was like the silver medalist in that category. So, it's widely recognized as pretty good. These two guys, John Mead and Peter Gurry, they teach at Phoenix Seminary. They run something at Phoenix Seminary that's called the Text and Canon Institute. So, they're experts. John Mead is, maybe he's more into Old Testament. Peter Gurry is more into New Testament. So they complement each other pretty well. And it talks about the text of the New Testament, the text of the Old Testament, the canon, the history of the English Bible. And it's written for laymen. It is written from a believer's standpoint.
You have written a book with Dr. Mead.
Yeah, I've written a book with Dr. Mead on the canon, biblical canon lists in early Christianity. So I know him pretty well. I've met Peter Gurry several times. I've been to Phoenix Seminary. I participated in a conference there with the Text and Canon Institute. So I'd recommend that as a good place to start. They've got further reading in there as well if you want to pursue it. Like I say, that's from a believer's standpoint. There are books written from a more secular standpoint, or from even maybe sort of hostile standpoint. And I'll mention one from sort of a more hostile standpoint that was super popular. It was actually a New York Times bestseller. Came out maybe almost 2 decades ago now. Bart Ehrman, whose name will be familiar to some of our listeners. He has been a longtime teacher at UNC, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus. Like I say, New York Times bestseller. Um, the but I would say, and I've heard other people say this as well, other people who are approaching the matter from a believing confessional standpoint have said it's actually a pretty good book in the middle, in the big
Mm.
middle, where he's now Bart Ehrman he's a legit New Testament textual critic that he came up into the scholarly world. He studied with Bruce Metzger.
Yes.
He is he became known. Now he's done other things since then. He's got a book on the historical Jesus and other things. He calls himself an atheist now. For a long time, he called himself an agnostic.
Mhm.
I think when he wrote Misquoting Jesus, he was calling himself an agnostic. So that gives you an idea of sort of where he's coming from. But he's also an expert in the textual criticism of the New Testament, and I think that it's a really good book in terms of a very basic, easy to follow presentation of what is it that New Testament textual critics do, what is our text of the New Testament based on, what are the variants, and what sort of value do they have, and just all kinds of things to do with this world. And like I say, I've heard other people say that as well, that it's really good in that big middle. The problem, I would say, from a confessional standpoint, from a believer standpoint, is the introduction and the conclusion,
Mm.
which is sort of like, that's why you can't trust the New Testament, or that's why Christianity is, a house of cards. It's because, or at least part of the reason, I think you would say more than that, but a big part of the reason is that the text of the New Testament is untrustworthy. Like I say, from my perspective, when he actually lays out the evidence, he doesn't seem to think it's untrustworthy. He seems to
Mm.
think he knows very well what Paul said or what
Mhm.
Matthew said or things of that nature. So, I will say, just to be as generous as possible to him, I approach the matter from a different perspective.
Mhm.
So, uh, but that would also be a good place to start to see how someone from that perspective thinks through these sorts of issues. And then between those sort of two extremes, well, I wouldn't call Mead and Gurry extreme at all, but they do represent a confessional standpoint. Between
Right.
between those two poles, there are just a variety of books you could look at, and of course, continue to listen to this podcast.
Mm. And I'm sure at
Um,
some point you will publish a book of some kind
Probably, I have
along
been
these
gathering
this lines.
material for a while, so probably I will publish something in this area. Um, let's see. Also, I wanted to mention about textual variants. Last time we started talking about textual variants, I may have given the impression that all textual variants are sort of minor and irrelevant, and I don't mean to give that impression if I did. There are some bigger textual variants, and probably some of our listeners already know what they are. Of course, the two biggest, and we will have perhaps multiple episodes later in the season when we talk about these two particular textual variants, are the story of the adulterous woman in John 8 and the ending of Mark. That's Mark 16, starting at verse 9. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about yet, well, if you're curious, just go ahead and look at your English Bible at those two passages and take a look at the marginal notes and see what you find. In fact, in some Bibles, when you get to Mark 16 verse 8 And then you look right after that, there's going to be like this bar that appears, like this straight horizontal line separating verse 8 from verse 9. And then there's going to be a note in the text. Some manuscripts don't have what follows. They make it very, very clear that verses 9 through 20 are textually suspect. I'll put it in those terms. And the same thing happens in John 8, the story of the adulterous woman. Those are, of course, significant variants. They are the two longest major variants in the New Testament manuscripts. I think we could have a conversation about to what extent does the problematic nature of those passages actually throw into doubt anything that we really care about as Christians. And I think we will have that conversation later in this season. But I just want to go ahead and throw those two out there as, look, there are some major variants that do matter. I don't mean to say all the variants are irrelevant or anything close to that. Even some of the variants that are much smaller are relevant in terms of maybe affecting the meaning of a verse, maybe affecting the meaning of a passage. So you do have that. And there, besides Mark 16 and John 8, there are others that are, would be surprising, I think, to people that, oh, there's some doubt about this particular passage. And we'll try to discuss several of those during the course of the season. So, yes, these variants are important. And they do result in some of our English Bibles being different from one another, as some English Bibles maybe have passages that other English Bibles don't have because the translators are making different judgments about what the text said. I think I would still want to argue that even so, there's no doctrine of Christianity that is suspect, or there's no theological principle that is in doubt based on these passages. So you could talk about, are the textual variants relevant or not? Well, I guess relevant for what would be one of the responses to that. And I just read this today. I picked up my copy here of Scribes in Scripture by Mead and Gurry. And I presume Peter Gurry wrote this portion on the New Testament. I'm reading now from page 100 of their book, and where he gives the example of Jude, the little one chapter book of Jude near the end of the New Testament. I think part of the reason he gives the example of Jude is not only that it's short, but it has been studied exhaustively in terms of the manuscripts. I think I mentioned last time or the time before that there are thousands of New Testament manuscripts. And so it is not the case that for every book of the Bible that those manuscripts have been studied exhaustively. But for a little book like the book of Jude, it has happened. And originally there was a guy named Tommy Wasserman who did a dissertation where he did that for the book of Jude. That was maybe 15 years ago that happened. So I'm reading from Mead and Gurry, Scribes in Scripture, page 100. It says, Jude is a short book with 25 verses and only 461 words in Greek. So the whole book of Jude has 461 words. We have about 560 Greek manuscripts of Jude. All right, 560 manuscripts. A very careful catalog of their differences lists a total of 1,694 variants. All right. So, I mean, sometimes you will hear, like, especially from people that want to attack the integrity of the New Testament, they will say, there are more variants among the manuscripts of the New Testament than there are words in the New Testament. Well, I think that's probably true. Yeah. And it's certainly true when you look at that for the book of Jude. There are more variants among the manuscripts of Jude than there are words in Jude by about 3 times the number, right? So 461 words in Jude, 1,694 variants among the 560 Greek manuscripts. Okay, I'm going to keep reading now. Most are of concern, most of those variants are of concern only to some professional textual critics. Okay, they explain what they mean now. More than 50% of them, and they give the number at 909 of those variants, in Jude are either nonsense readings, singular readings, or both. Okay, what's a nonsense reading? They say a nonsense reading is one in which the scribe flubbed so that the result doesn't make any sense, as when you type TEH for thee in an email. And I don't know how many times I've done that in my life, just countless times. Right. So it's that kind of thing. So we've got 1,694 variants, but a whole bunch of them are just like misspellings of words, just nonsense. They produce nonsense. So is that important? Well, no, not really. I mean, a singular reading is one that is found in only one manuscript. So we got 560 manuscripts, but some of the variants that we have are only appear in one of them. So you could argue that those aren't real important. Most of these singular readings are also obvious mistakes. Okay, so more than half of the total number of variants are just, nothing that you would want to concern yourself with. Of the remaining, I'm still reading from Mead and Gurry, of the remaining 785 variants in Jude, so there are 785 variants that cannot be obviously attributed to just a mistake of the scribe. Of those, there are about 145 that are listed in the edition of the New Testament we've talked about called the Nestle Aland, the 28th edition. I talked about it in previous episodes. We'll probably see, we'll talk about it again in just a little bit.
It's the blue one.
It's the blue one.
For people
right.
like me, it's the blue one.
Yes. So in the critical apparatus at the bottom of the page, if you go to Jude and you see how many textual variants they actually take note of in that blue edition in A28, it's about 145. All right. In the red edition, that number goes down to about 47. Do you remember that I said one of the differences between the blue and the red, between the NA edition and the UBS edition, is that the UBS edition takes note of fewer areas of variation, but gives more information about each one. Because what they're trying to do is provide a resource for translators. And the assumption behind the edition is that not all the textual variants will actually show up in translation. That when you translate it, it's something you might notice in Greek, but when you translate it into some other language, it's just not something that is the kind of thing that can actually be translated. So that's another way of thinking through, is it important? Well, in a way, but it's not important enough to actually affect the meaning in another language, it seems. So with that, you get down to 47 of the variants in Jude are important enough to put in the apparatus of the UBS edition. And then if you go beyond that and you look at English Bibles, they've taken, this is again Peter and Gurry, taking note of, if you go to Jude in some major English Bibles, how many times do those in the footnotes or the marginal notes do they actually note that our manuscripts disagree with one another? They have, let's see, The ESV notes one time in Jude when that happens. The NIV notes two times, and the Christian Standard Bible has five instances in the Epistle of Jude where they take note of these sorts of differences. So I think that gives us a good illustration of the importance of the kinds of things we're talking about. The vast majority of them are important for a very limited selection of people. At what point does it become important for like people who don't know Greek or people who use the English Bible? Well, a much reduced number, so our Bible translators think that there's a few in the Epistle of Jude that you might want to know about.
And I think one of the things and I feel certain we've mentioned it before, is that the Bible is not the only ancient book with textual variants.
Yeah.
All of them have them. And I understand the criticism. I understand the rebuttal to that. Maybe, yeah, but they're not claiming to be inspired. I got all that.
Mm-hmm.
But we're talking about a text that's been transmitted countless times. You can expect variants. And that's a little hard for us to understand because we live in a printing press type, mass produce exact copies. And so it's just something to keep in mind with our variants. That is
not unique to the Bible at all.
At all.
All right, well, let's talk about those streams of evidence then. And I think, let me see if I can figure out how to share my screen again. Okay, so we've got 3 streams of evidence. Now, yeah, I mean, when we're talking about the text of the Greek New Testament, what are the major categories of evidence that we are talking about that are taken account of in an apparatus to the Greek New Testament? We've got 3 major categories. We've got Greek manuscripts, ancient versions, that is to say translations, and then we've got the church fathers. Let's talk about each one of those. And this is in the order of importance, right? Certainly the Greek manuscripts are the most important stream of evidence for the text of the Greek New Testament, I think, for obvious reasons. There are different kinds of Greek manuscripts, and when we think through them a little bit more, we'll talk about those different kinds. Let me go ahead and give you like what I mean. There are basically 4 kinds of Greek manuscripts as divided by like modern editions of the New Testament, and textual critics think about them and talk about them in these ways, these 4 kinds. Whether ancient people or medieval people thought about them as 4 kinds, I don't know, but modern people usually do think about them as in these 4 categories. Number 1, Greek manuscripts written on the material papyrus as opposed to animal skin. Papyrus is a plant, and there's a lot of most medieval Greek manuscripts are written on animal skin, if you want to call it parchment or vellum, there's actually a difference based on what animal it comes from, but whatever, animal skin. But so the papyrus is usually thought of as as the earlier writing material. Okay, so there's I don't know, we can look how many. I'll talk about how we can determine the number of how many manuscripts there are on this particular writing material, but there's maybe 130 or so papyrus manuscripts. Okay, usually thought of as earlier. So there's the writing material. And then there are 2 types of handwriting that form these categories that I'm talking about. There's sort of what's called the majuscule handwriting, and there's the minuscule handwriting. Now, these are both associated with, like I say, leather, or not leather, but animal skin writing material. But we're not talking about the writing material. We're talking about the style of handwriting. Basically, to put it in simple terms, uppercase and lowercase, or uppercase and then cursive. And again, this has to do with time. One of the ways in which these are different is time. The uppercase, or the majuscule is another name for that, is typically earlier. The minuscule, or the cursive, the lowercase, is typically later. When I say later, I mean like 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, whereas the majuscule, the uppercase, is earlier than that. Let's say, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. So those are the first three. We've got papyrus, majuscule, and minuscule. And then the fourth kind of Greek manuscript is called lectionary, which is a kind of a manuscript in Greek that is an excerpt of passages from the Bible and designed. It doesn't have the whole biblical text, it's just got excerpts from the Bible designed for the public reading in a church setting. So there are churches that follow a lectionary, or a sort of a church calendar where you have assigned readings for particular days, but you don't read the entire Bible, you just read selections of the Bible. And so these sorts of manuscripts just have those selections in them. So lectionaries is what they're called. So we've got the Greek manuscripts, we've got papyrus, majuscule, minuscule, and lectionaries. Okay, so definitely the most important kind of manuscript, uh, kind of evidence. The second is ancient versions. So very early on, the New Testament was translated, for instance, into Latin. Already in the late 2nd century, in the 3rd century, the New Testament was translated from Greek into Latin. Also, very early Syriac. And then later on, Coptic was early. And then, we've also got Georgian, we've got Slavonic, we've got Armenian, we've got just all kinds of translations into other languages. These are obviously not as useful in reconstructing the text of the earliest text of the Greek New Testament because, well, they're not in Greek, but the value of them is that they attest a Greek translation, or a Greek manuscript that they were translated from. So if you look at the Old Latin, and you can oftentimes imagine, hypothesize what the Greek text was that the Latin was translated from, or the Coptic, or the whatever language you're looking at. So those are also taken into account. And then the third category is the church fathers. The church fathers are the early Christians who lived usually 2nd through the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. And the value here, they quoted the Bible a ton. They wrote commentaries on the Bible in which they're quoting the Bible. They wrote treatises in which they quoted the Bible. They wrote letters in which they quoted the Bible, just all kinds of stuff. And they're quoting the Bible all the time. And so the value there is that when they quote, you can say, okay, they must know the text in this form. And of course, you've got Greek church fathers who do that. You've got Latin church fathers who do that. You've got church fathers who write in other languages who also do that. So there's a lot of evidence there also. And it's in this order: Greek manuscripts, ancient versions, and then church fathers, that the critical apparatus is arranged. So when you look at a critical apparatus of the Greek New Testament, you get the blue edition or you get the red edition, and you look at how they are presenting the evidence. They are first going to list, for any particular variant, they're going to list the Greek manuscripts, and then they're going to list the ancient versions, and then they're going to list the church fathers that go along with that. Not only that, but they're also, for the Greek manuscripts, they're going to list the Greek manuscripts in the order of the categories that I gave earlier. First papyri, then majuscules, then minuscules, and then finally lectionaries. All right. And if you take all this evidence, as I've got in my notes here, if you take all this evidence, what you're going to end up with is an eclectic edition. sometimes people refer to this it also as a synonym, a critical edition, an eclectic edition or a critical edition. And it does not precisely match any Greek manuscript. So if you look at NA 28, it does not correspond to, there is not a single Greek manuscript of the New Testament that matches precisely what scholars have reconstructed as the earliest form of the text. And that's because the manuscripts are going to have mistakes in them. You know, again, misspellings or added in words or whatever. They're just going to have mistakes. And of course, the scholars who are reconstructing the earliest form of the text are trying to eliminate all those mistakes. But also they're making judgments among variants, taking all this and reconstructing. So it is a reconstruction. I'm using that word because it doesn't correspond to any physical manuscript that we actually have. It corresponds hypothetically to the earliest form of the text, which we don't have. So then at the bottom of the page, they try to justify that, what they have guessed as the earliest form of the text. They justify it by listing all the evidence. There are other ways of doing it. There are other ways of constructing a critical text of an ancient work. So the Hebrew Bible, for instance, so far has not been published as an eclectic text. It actually is in process at the moment, but so far the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, is the one that scholars use as the standard text is a diplomatic edition, not an eclectic edition. A diplomatic edition is a presentation of one single manuscript. So what the editors of the Hebrew Bible have done so far, and I'm saying so far again because it's about to change. There is a project underway to do an eclectic edition, but it's not published yet. There's only one book published so far, and that's Proverbs. So the rest of it is to come. But so far in modern text critical studies of the Hebrew Bible, the end product has been a diplomatic edition. The editors of the Hebrew Bible have simply selected a particular Hebrew manuscript of the Hebrew Bible and printed it. Printed its text as the main text, and then at the bottom of the page in the critical apparatus, they have taken note of other readings, the Dead Sea Scrolls, other manuscripts, but they haven't allowed the evidence of the other witnesses to affect the text. They have simply printed a single manuscript. And usually you do that when you think, well, I'm not sure that we can really improve on that at this time. We don't have enough information to go back behind that. By the way, the manuscript that they selected is called the Leningrad Codex, and it's from about the year 1009 AD. So it's not, in terms of chronology, it's not super close to the original text of the writing of the Hebrew Bible, but why did they select the Leningrad Codex? Because it is the earliest complete manuscript of the Hebrew Bible currently in existence. So it's from 1009. All the other complete manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible are later than that. All right, but that's not the way it goes for the New Testament. The New Testament textual critics generally think our evidence is so early and so good in terms of quality that it allows us to produce a better text than what our current manuscripts witness. We can gather all the evidence and reconstruct a better text. That is also the way it is for the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. It's a reconstructed text. All right, so those are the streams of evidence used and the result that they have. And I think, Brad, are we about out of time on this one?
So
And so next time we'll look more at the printing press and how that has affected our conception. And we will delve into like what some of the important manuscripts and then get back to some more textual variants.
All right. Well, these are the streams of evidence. And again, what we're doing this season is we're kind of shortening the episodes, but producing more of them. And so normally we would just be getting warmed up
Yeah, right.
under the old way, just audio. But remember also that now we're producing video. And so you can, episodes are released each and every Wednesday. You can find them on our website at thelightnetwork.tv. Social media platforms will alert you to their release. Of course, any podcasting platform you can follow, subscribe. I still don't know what they call it these days, but you can click that button that will send it to you immediately when it is released. And also, we're now doing video, and so it's available on YouTube. You can follow, like, subscribe there, and be alerted each time a new episode is published. And so we're grateful you were with us today. I want to remind you can email us, scholars@thelightnetwork.tv. And we always enjoy that interaction. We're grateful again that you were with us today, and we'll meet you again next week as we go back inside the Scholar Study.